All right, let's dive into the world of open educational resources. And get this, we're going all the way to Singapore for this one, to see how they're changing the game when it comes to teaching physics. You ever notice how some things, they just make so much more sense when you can actually see them in action? That's what we're looking at today.
Yeah, and what's really fascinating here is it's not just some random experiment. We're talking about a whole bunch of junior colleges and schools in Singapore, all teaming up to create an entire physics curriculum using open source software. We're going to be digging into a blog post from May 21st, 2013. It talks about a sharing session at the National Institute of Education in Singapore, where they presented this project.
You're not kidding about a bunch of schools. We're talking Raffles Institution, Yishun Junior College, Anglo-Chinese Junior College, Innova Junior College, and S. Serangoon Junior College, all working together on this. Plus, they had support from the Ministry of Education. It really shows you how much they value collaboration and innovation over there.
Oh, absolutely. And this project, it's a perfect example of what we call open educational resources, or OER for short,
OER.
basically. OER are any materials used for teaching, learning, or even research that are totally free for anyone to use, adapt, and share.
So anything goes, textbooks, lesson plans,
Yeah.
videos,
You name it. And in this case, they're
Yeah.
focusing on open source physics,
which is,
or OSP, which basically means they're using software and simulations to make physics concepts come alive.
okay, so I get the idea. But what does that actually look like in practice? I mean, the blog post mentions a whole bunch of different simulations they developed.
It really is impressive. The variety is amazing. We're talking simulations for collision carts, gravitational fields, wave superposition, electric field lines, pretty much anything you can think of, they probably have a simulation for it.
Wow. So instead of just reading about these concepts in a textbook, students can actually play around with them virtually. I can only imagine what my 15-year-old self would have thought about that. I remember struggling so much with wave mechanics back in the day. Having a simulation like that would have been a game changer.
I hear you. It's all about making those abstract concepts come alive, letting students learn by actually doing stuff, not just reading. One cool example that stands out is the ripple tank model.
Oh, yeah.
It takes those complicated physics equations and simplifies them. And it lets you visualize how waves work, both in 2D and 3D.
So you can actually see those wave patterns forming.
Exactly. You can tweak different variables and see how those changes affect the waves in real time. It's a much more intuitive way to learn than just staring at equations on a page.
Definitely. Makes a lot of sense. Now, what about this sharing session itself? Was it just a bunch of teachers standing up and talking at each other? Or was it more hands-on?
Oh, no. It was definitely designed to be interactive. They had all these different learning stations set up where people could actually try out the simulations for themselves.
I was going to say, what's the point of telling people about these amazing tools if you don't let them play around with them?
Right. It's about empowering educators to see the potential of OSP and how it can totally transform the way they teach.
Makes sense. Now, all of this is happening in Singapore, but I'm guessing this whole open educational resources thing, it's bigger than just one country, right?
No, absolutely. Singapore is a great example. But the OER and OSP movements are global, all over the world. Educators and researchers, and even developers. They're all embracing open licensing and working together to create and share high-quality educational materials.
So what we're seeing is a real shift in how we think about creating and sharing knowledge. It's like we're moving away from this old model, where knowledge is something that's locked away and controlled, and moving towards something more open, more collaborative, where everyone can contribute.
Exactly. It's a whole new way of thinking about knowledge.
And this specific project may be about physics. But these principles, they can be applied to pretty much any subject, right?
Oh, yeah, definitely.
That's what I find so exciting about all this. It's not just about physics. It's about rethinking the possibilities of education and how we can make it more accessible and engaging for everyone. But before we go too far down that road, let's talk about some of the other simulations mentioned in the blog post. What about the superposition model? What's that one all about?
Well, the superposition model, it's all about showing you how waves combine when you have multiple waves. They've added some really cool features to it to make it super user-friendly. For example, there's an auto-scaling x-axis, so you can always see the whole wave.
Oh, that's neat.
And there's this button that shifts the wave by 1/8 of a period, which can be really helpful when you're trying to understand wave interference.
So they really put some thought into making these simulations both educational and fun.
For sure, they definitely focused on making them easy to use for both teachers and students.
I like it. The blog post also talks about a two charges model.
Oh, yeah.
What's that one all about?
That one's all about visualizing electric field lines. It lets you see how the electric field changes, depending on the strength and the sign of the charges.
So you can actually see how positive and negative charges interact
Mm-hmm.
and how that creates those invisible field lines
Yeah.
that we always hear about, but never actually get to see.
Exactly. It brings the concept to life in a way that's way easier to understand than just looking at diagrams in a textbook.
Way easier.
Mm.
And from what I'm gathering, it seems like they've covered a pretty wide range of physics concepts with these simulations.
Oh, they definitely have. The blog post lists simulations for everything, from collision carts to a falling magnet through a coil to Kepler's laws of planetary motion, Earth and moon gravity, geostationary satellites, even projectile motion.
It's like a physics playground.
Exactly.
A digital one,
Yeah.
but still.
It's amazing what they were able to do through collaboration.
And it wasn't just about creating the simulations. They also put together worksheets and other materials to help teachers integrate these simulations into their lessons.
Absolutely. They created a whole ecosystem around these simulations, making it as easy as possible for teachers to use them and to adapt them to their specific needs.
That's smart.
And remember, all of this is being shared under a Creative Commons attribution license.
Which we
Anyone can use and modify these materials as long as they give credit to the original creators. It's a big part of the open source philosophy.
I like that. Speaking of sharing, this sharing session at the National Institute of Education, did they just talk about the project, or did they actually let people try out the simulations?
Oh, they definitely encouraged hands-on learning. They had the session structured in 3 parts. First, a quick overview, then an hour of hands-on exploration at those learning stations, and then they had a discussion at the end where everyone could share their thoughts and ideas.
So it was a very active session.
Oh, yeah. It wasn't just a lecture.
That's good. You learn best by doing, right?
Exactly.
What are your thoughts on their approach? Do you think it was just a presentation, or did it feel like they were trying to build a community around these resources?
I think they were definitely going for the community aspect
Right.
by bringing educators together, letting them try out the simulations, and giving them a chance to talk to each other. It created a sense of ownership and encouraged collaboration.
I see what you mean. It's one thing to create amazing resources, but it's another thing entirely to build a community around those resources. A community where people feel like they can use them, adapt them, and contribute back to the project.
Exactly. And that sense of community, it's crucial if you want these kinds of projects to be sustainable in the long run.
That makes sense.
Mm.
Now, this all sounds incredibly promising, but I'm sure there are challenges too. It can't all be sunshine and roses. What are some of the hurdles they might face when it comes to implementing and sustaining this kind of initiative?
That's a great question, and one we should definitely explore further. The collaborative spirit is fantastic, but one of the challenges is making sure all these shared resources are high quality and accurate. And then there's the question of funding and support. These kinds of projects need ongoing resources if you want to maintain them and keep the simulations up to date and to provide technical support to users.
Right. Those are all important considerations. It's easy to get caught up in the excitement of a new project, but it's important to think about the long term too.
Definitely. And that's something we'll dig into more deeply in the next part of our deep dive.
I'm looking forward to it. We'll unpack those challenges and explore how this whole open educational resources movement might evolve in the future. But for now, let's take a quick break, and then we'll come back and explore the broader implications of this approach.
Sounds good to me.
Welcome back. So before the break, we were talking about Singapore's awesome physics project, and you mentioned some potential challenges, like quality control and funding. And those are definitely things to consider, because this isn't just about one project in Singapore. It's a whole movement.
Right. Exactly. What we're seeing in Singapore is just a small piece of a much bigger trend for its open educational resources. And it's happening all over the world, not just in physics, but across all sorts of subjects.
Okay, so paint me a picture. What does this global trend look like in other fields?
Well, imagine this. You have access to this massive online library full of math textbooks, problem sets, interactive simulations, and it's all constantly being updated, and it's all completely free.
Wow.
That's what's happening in math right now. There are all these online platforms popping up, offering open source resources tailored to different learning styles and different levels.
That's amazing. It's like having this global team of math experts all working together to make sure these resources are top-notch.
Exactly. And because these resources are open, teachers can adapt them to fit their own curriculum or their own teaching style.
So it's not just about free access, it's about flexibility too. I bet this isn't just limited to STEM fields either.
You're right. The humanities are getting involved too. We're seeing these digital archives being created that have all these primary source documents from history, literature, you name it.
So instead of these documents being locked away
Yeah.
in some dusty library somewhere,
Right.
anyone with an internet connection can access them.
That's the idea. It's like democratizing knowledge. Anyone can be a historian.
That's incredible. This whole thing is really making me think about how this shift towards openness could change the way we learn and teach in the future.
That's the big question, isn't it? What if education was constantly evolving? What if it was shaped by this global community of educators and learners? It would be totally different from the way things are now.
It would be a revolution.
Pretty much.
But like you said before, there are challenges too. How do we make sure everything is high quality when anyone can create and share educational materials?
That's a big one. Quality control. When you have a global community contributing, you need ways to make sure the information is accurate and reliable.
And that it's actually good for teaching.
Exactly. We need to think about things like peer review, community feedback systems, maybe even some kind of accreditation for OER materials.
So it's not enough to just throw resources out there. We need systems to make sure they're good.
Exactly.
What about sustainability? Who's going to pay for all this?
That's another hurdle. Developing high-quality OER takes time and effort and money. We need to figure out how to fund these projects, whether it's through government grants or philanthropic support or some combination of both.
It sounds like we need a whole new infrastructure
Yeah,
to support this shift towards open education.
you do. But it's an exciting challenge.
It is.
We have this opportunity to create something totally new, something that makes knowledge accessible to everyone.
I like that you're focusing on the opportunities.
It's important to be realistic about the challenges, but we also need to be optimistic about the potential.
Okay, so we've talked about how this open approach is working in education. But what about outside the classroom? Could this work in professional fields too?
Now, that's where things get really interesting. Imagine a platform where professionals from all walks of life, doctors, lawyers, engineers, artists, they can all share their expertise, their best practices, even create open source training material.
It would be like this massive global mentorship program
Exactly.
available to anyone who wants to learn.
And think about how valuable that would be for fields that are constantly changing, where it's hard to keep up with the latest advancements.
It's like those online communities for software developers, where they share code and tutorials.
Exactly. Those are great examples of the open source ethos. And it's not just limited to tech. We're seeing similar communities popping up in design, marketing, even healthcare.
It's like we're tapping into this collective wisdom
Right.
and making it accessible to everyone.
And breaking down those traditional barriers that prevent people from learning and growing.
I love it.
And this is just the beginning. As technology gets better and we become more connected, I think we'll see even more creative ways to use open educational resources.
It's an exciting time to be alive. But let's be real. Taking this open approach outside of academia, it's going to come with its own set of challenges.
Oh, yeah, for sure. One of the biggest challenges is going to be overcoming institutional inertia.
What do you mean by that?
A lot of organizations and industries, they're still really attached to the old ways of doing things. When it comes to knowledge and professional development, they might resist this more open and collaborative approach.
So there might be pushback from the people who benefit from the status quo.
Exactly.
What kinds of concerns might they have?
Well, they might be worried about intellectual property rights, or maintaining quality control, or even the potential disruption of existing power structures. Some organizations might not want to share their knowledge freely because they're afraid it will give their competitors an advantage.
I can understand that.
It's a big change. It requires a shift in mindset. You have to start thinking about knowledge as something that grows when you share it, not something that you lose when you give it away.
Right. It's like that saying, a rising tide lifts all boats.
Exactly.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground here. From Singapore's physics project to the global implications of OER in all sorts of fields. But before we wrap up, what are some of the potential pitfalls we need to be mindful of as this movement evolves?
That's an important question. One of the biggest things we need to watch out for is making sure this movement is inclusive and accessible to everyone.
What do you mean by that?
These resources need to be available to everyone, no matter who they are, where they live, or how much money they have.
Right.
We don't want this movement to create new forms of inequality.
So how do we prevent that from happening?
We need to make sure these resources are available in multiple languages. We need to make sure they're accessible to people with disabilities. And we need to make sure they're relevant to different cultures.
Mhm.
We also need to address the digital divide. Not everyone has access to the technology they need to use these resources.
So we need to be very intentional about equity and inclusion.
Absolutely. If we're not careful, this movement could end up reinforcing the inequalities that already exist.
That's a good point. Well, this has been a fascinating conversation about the potential of open educational resources. Before we move on to our final part, what's one key takeaway you want to leave our listener with?
I think the most important thing to remember is this movement is about more than just free stuff. It's about creating a culture of sharing and collaboration and lifelong learning. It's about giving people the power to take control of their own education and to contribute to this global knowledge commons that benefits everyone.
That's a powerful message. And on that note, let's take another quick pause, and then we'll come back and explore how our listener can get involved in this exciting movement.
All right, we're back. And after that whirlwind tour of the OER world, I bet our listeners are thinking, okay, I'm sold. But how do I actually get involved?
Well, that's the beauty of it. It's so easy to get involved with OER. You don't need a special invitation or anything.
Really?
Yeah, you don't need to be a teacher or a coder. You don't even have to be an expert in any particular subject.
So no PhD required.
Nope.
That's good to know. So what would you say is a good first step for someone who's just starting to explore OER?
Honestly, just start by using and sharing OER materials. That's a huge contribution in itself. Every time you use these resources in your own learning or share them with someone else, you're supporting the movement.
It's like putting your money where your mouth is,
Exactly.
or in this case,
Yeah.
your time and attention. Now, what if I want to do more than just use OER? What if I want to actually create something? If you're ready to take the plunge, there are tons of ways to contribute. You could join an existing OER project or even start your own. There are all these online communities and platforms where you can connect with other people who are passionate about OER and collaborate on projects.
That sounds awesome,
Yeah.
but also a little intimidating. What if I don't have the skills to create something from scratch?
Trust me, you don't have to be a coding genius or a master teacher to make a valuable contribution.
Okay.
There are so many ways to get involved. You could offer to edit materials, proofread, translate, create graphics. You could even just provide feedback on existing resources.
So even if I'm not an expert in a particular subject, I can still help out.
Absolutely. Every contribution matters, no matter how big or small.
I like that. This whole conversation has been really eye-opening. What's one final piece of advice you would give to someone who's excited about OER and wants to get more involved?
I would say, stay curious. Be open to new ideas. And don't be afraid to experiment. There's no one right way to do OER. Find what you're passionate about and find a way to contribute that feels meaningful to you.
That's great advice. So it's not just about using free resources. It's about embracing this whole new way of thinking about knowledge and education.
Exactly.
Well, that brings us to the end of our deep dive into open educational resources. We've covered a lot of ground today, from Singapore to the global OER movement. We've talked about the challenges and the opportunities, and most importantly, how you can get involved. We hope you've enjoyed this exploration, and we encourage you to continue learning about OER and to find your own way to contribute. The future of education is in our hands, and together, we can make it something truly amazing. Thanks for listening.